The phone rang in the middle of my grilled mahi-mahi, 4,000 miles from the house where I'd spent 40 years being underestimated. I looked at the screen, my son's name. I let it ring twice before I answered, because a man should never look eager to hear his own verdict read aloud. "Where is the table?" Bridget was screaming before I even said hello. "Where is the food? Where is your wife?" "My name is Walter Ashford. I'm 66 years old. I spent 40 years as a forensic auditor, tracking hidden money for federal courts, and I know exactly what a lie sounds like when it's cracking open in real time. This one sounded beautiful. 2 weeks earlier, my daughter-in-law had handed my wife an 18-dish Thanksgiving menu and ordered her to cook it alone, 10 months after Marlene's double knee replacement, with an instruction folded into the fine print that she was to stay hidden in the kitchen so she wouldn't ruin the aesthetic for Bridget's wealthy parents. My son knew about it. My son had approved it. So I booked 2 first-class tickets to Kauai, packed 1 suitcase each, and left a single handwritten note on the bare floor of our dining room, right where the head of a 12-seat mahogany table used to sit before I had it hauled away that same afternoon. Now they were standing in that empty room, and my son wanted an explanation. He was going to get one, just not the one he wanted. Marlene and I built that house cent by cent. I audited fraud for federal courts for 4 decades, the kind of work where men in good suits swear they've told you everything, and you find out otherwise by tracing a wire transfer through 6 shell accounts. I was good at it. I was patient, methodical, and I never raised my voice, because rage is sloppy and sloppy men get caught. We gave Curtis everything a father is supposed to give a son: college, tuition paid in full, a down payment on his first apartment. Later, when he wanted to look successful for a new job downtown, I co-signed the lease on a luxury SUV without blinking, because that's what fathers do. You build the net so your children never have to feel the ground. Marlene gave more. She gave the version of motherhood that doesn't show up on any ledger. Every holiday dinner cooked from scratch, every graduation, every just this once that turned into 40 years of once. When Curtis married Bridget, Marlene welcomed her the way she welcomed everyone, with an apron, a full table, and no expectation of anything back. We trusted them completely. That was the mistake, if you want to call devotion a mistake. I don't. But trust is exactly the kind of thing a smart man learns to verify. It started with a sink full of cold, greasy water. I came home to find Marlene scrubbing plates from a party Bridget had thrown the night before, wincing every time she shifted her weight off her surgical knee. 10 months of physical therapy, and she was standing there anyway, because Bridget had asked, and Marlene never learned how to say no to family. I called Curtis. I asked him to send a cleaning crew. He told me I was overreacting, that Bridget was overwhelmed, prepping for her parents' visit, and that a little standing might be good for Marlene's joints anyway. He said it like he was doing me a favor by explaining it. I didn't argue. I hung up and went to my study, because arguments require 2 people willing to be reasoned with, and I'd just discovered I wasn't dealing with one. That night, I logged into the emergency medical account I'd set up for Marlene. The fund meant strictly for her co-pays, her physical therapy, her future surgeries. The balance was low, too low. I traced the transfers the way I'd traced 100 fraudulent ledgers before. Small, precise withdrawals, timed to slip under automated alerts. 6 months of bleeding, funneled straight to a luxury auto dealership. My son had drained his mother's recovery fund to lease the exact car he was currently parking in our driveway to impress his in-laws. I sat with that for a long moment. No anger came, just clarity, the specific, terrible clarity of an auditor who has just found the missing ledger and realized the fraud was never hidden that well to begin with. They just never expected anyone to look. I didn't confront him, not yet. An auditor's first rule: never tip your hand before the file is complete. I went back to the kitchen, sat with Marlene, and let her think I was simply worried about her knees. I made no accusations. I made no calls to Curtis that night. The next afternoon, Bridget walked into our living room without knocking, dropped a thick embossed envelope on the coffee table, and informed Marlene, not asked, informed, that she'd be cooking 18 dishes alone over 3 days and staying out of sight once guests arrived, because older people ruin the aesthetic. I stood between them and told her to leave. She laughed in my face and said Curtis had already promised her the house. That was the piece of evidence I didn't even have to go looking for. She'd handed it to me herself, gift-wrapped in her own arrogance. The confirmation that my son had authorized every bit of this, out loud, to his wife, before either of them ever stepped through our door. I burned the menu in the fireplace that night. Not out of rage, out of ceremony. I wanted to watch the terms of my mother's humiliation turn to ash before I decided what came next. The next morning, I drove to see Desmond Pruitt, a lawyer I'd worked alongside for 20 years of federal depositions. I brought him bank statements with the fraudulent transfers highlighted in yellow, 6 months, thousands of dollars, all routed to that dealership. He didn't ask to borrow it, I told Desmond. He took it. We moved fast and quiet. First, I withdrew my guarantor status on the SUV lease, which would trigger an automatic default with the dealership by end of business. Second, we drained the compromised joint account and moved every remaining cent into a trust, accessible only by Marlene and me, fully insulated from further borrowing. Third, the heaviest item, I had Desmond strike Curtis entirely from our will, redirecting the estate to a foundation for elderly victims of family financial abuse. 3 signatures, under 10 minutes. My son had spent 35 years assuming that inheritance was a guarantee written in blood. It wasn't. It was conditional on decency, and he'd spent his down to zero. Curtis went to work the next morning with no idea any of it had happened. That's the strange, quiet advantage of a man who's never once considered his father capable of a countermove. I called an estate liquidator and had our 12-seat mahogany dining table, the table Bridget had built her entire Thanksgiving performance around, removed from the house within 2 hours. Every chair, every pedestal, gone. Then I packed 2 suitcases, wrote a single sentence on a sheet of stationery, and left it on the bare floor, exactly where the head of that table used to sit. Marlene and I boarded a flight to Kauai that same morning. One-way tickets, cellular network disabled, security cameras left running. 22 hours later, Curtis's luxury SUV pulled into the driveway with Bridget, her parents, and every expectation of a staged 5-star holiday. I watched it happen from a balcony 4,000 miles away, the confusion at the freezing, empty foyer, Bridget's voice cracking as she called for a mother-in-law who wasn't there, and then the walk into a dining room that no longer existed. There was a moment, watching the feed, where I second-guessed the note, wondered if I'd been too quiet, too clean, whether Curtis would simply laugh it off as a prank and move the party to a restaurant. He didn't. He walked to the center of the empty floor, picked up the single page, and read it 3 times like his brain refused to process it. Then he looked directly into the camera. He knew. The calls started within minutes. I let the first one ring on speaker over the sound of Pacific surf and said nothing until Bridget stopped screaming long enough to breathe. Then I told her exactly what was in the pantry, the raw turkey, the 10 pounds of potatoes, the caviar, and told her she had 3 hours to cook her own 18-dish menu since she'd written the schedule herself. When Curtis grabbed the phone, I gave him the full accounting. The stolen medical fund, the severed lease, the frozen trust, the rewritten will. I told him plainly, I'd spent 40 years finding men who stole from people who trusted them, and I never expected to find one at my own dining table. He dropped the phone. I watched it happen on the security feed before the call went dead. Within 2 weeks, the dominoes fell in order. His leased SUV was publicly repossessed in the middle of his office plaza, hooks and warning lights and a crowd of colleagues watching. Bridget's father, a major investor in Curtis's firm, pulled his capital the moment he understood what kind of man his daughter had married. The firm handed Curtis a cardboard box and a security escort to the elevator. Bridget filed for divorce before he'd even unpacked it. He showed up at our door 3 weeks later, wrinkled, hollow, begging through the security screen. I slid him a leather ledger through the mail slot, a complete, itemized accounting of every dollar he'd taken, and told him the door stayed locked until the debt was repaid, in full, with the last of his pride included. I closed the door. The deadbolt clicked. That was the last conversation we ever needed to have. Marlene's surgery fund was fully restored, her care rescheduled, her brace finally retired to a closet corner. The house stayed quiet, in a way it hadn't been in years. Not the tense quiet of endured disrespect, but the wide, breathing quiet of 2 people who finally owned their own peace. I never bought another dining table. The empty room stayed empty, on purpose. Every time I walked past it, I remembered exactly what it cost to get it back. Marlene walks without the brace now. We still don't own a 12-seat table, and we don't plan to. Curtis pays down what he owes in small, documented installments, the only kind of contact we allow, and the only kind that matters. I don't know if he's changed. I only know the door stays locked until the ledger balances, and some things, once burned, don't get rebuilt from the ashes. If you've ever handed someone your whole life and watched them treat it like a resource instead of a gift, you already know the ending doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with a closed door and a quiet room. Thanks for watching. If this story meant something to you, hit like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes.